So what we're talking about today for this session is what Henry Hazlitt knew and what you should know about inflation. So let me just, for a moment, talk about this book, Economics in One Lesson. So I know for me personally, I can say this without hyperbole, in terms of what I knew about economics before reading a particular book and what I knew after, this one book, that it's not that big, certainly changed my worldview more than any other book, more than anything Rothbard or Mises did. So to be clear, if I were to pick one book to say what formed my view the most, I suppose it would be Human Action in terms of the broader sense, but I'm saying the increment in terms of like, what did I understand about economics before and after? This one was the highest value add, if you want to use that terminology. And so I think that's probably true for a lot of people, because the special place that this book had. It was a bestseller. So let me just go through what I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to first explain who this Henry Hazlitt guy is in case he's not on your map. I'm going to give two definitions of inflation, and then I'm going to go through like the presentation that Hazlitt gives in his chapter on inflation, where it's naive confusion of money with wealth, redistribution of Cantillon effects, and the money illusion, real versus nominal wages. And finally, at the very end, so this first elements are going to be pretty standard introductory stuff, but then just as a little bonus for you overachievers, there is a part in this chapter. So I just reread it, before preparing this lecture, just to remind myself of exactly the presentation Hazlitt gives in his book. And there is a section that is possibly confusing or misleading. So if we have time at the end, I'll hit on that very quickly. Okay, so who is or was Henry Hazlitt? I would recommend, if you have the time, go look this up. So this is at Mises.org, that Bettina Greaves, she wrote this up as a sort of a memoriam to him. And he's a fascinating guy, born in the late 1800s. Among other things, he wrote for the Wall Street Journal, which may not surprise you, but he also wrote editorials for the New York Times on economic matters and also for Newsweek. Okay, and so when you see like what a free market, laissez-faire guy this is, he was instrumental when Mises first came over in getting him a job, because the academic community looked down their noses on Mises. So I'm saying Hazlitt is this like bomb-throwing free marketeer guy, and yet there was a period in human history when he was the one that the New York Times had to have an editorial on some economic topic. He was the guy for a while, right? So that just kind of shows you how much things have changed. And then why he ended up losing his perch at some of these sort of mainstream establishment organizations, outlets in terms of economic commentary, was he was not a fan of the Bretton Woods monetary arrangement that was after World War II. And Bettina explains the story in this piece, and says, I forget how exactly it went, but it was sort of like he wrote something critical of the Bretton Woods arrangement, and then the superiors kind of told him, I forget the way they put it, but you can't be writing articles like that. And so he didn't write more on that, but then he found some other posts somewhere, right? So he, in other words, didn't go against their wishes, but he realized I can't stay here if I'm not allowed to speak my mind on this stuff. All right, so fascinating guy. Lots of connections with the Foundation for Economic Education. He was friends with all the main players, a lot of the names on this room that you would have heard of. But as far as this book, Economics in One Lesson, in case you haven't read it, like the title, what does he mean? He just says right at the beginning that the difference between bad economics and good economics, or what makes someone an economist versus someone who's a hack, is that the economy, or let's say the person who's falling for fallacies, the bad economist, or the person who's ignorant of economic science, just looks at the immediate impact of a policy and only on the obvious beneficiaries of it, whereas the mark of a true economist is to not just look at the obvious beneficiaries of something, but also look at everybody in society to see the impacts on them, and not just to focus on the short term, but also the long-term consequences. So that's what the one lesson is. And then, so he's got it, it says the lesson stated, and then the rest of the book he just calls like the lesson applied. And then he just has chapters like on price controls, minimum wage, tariffs, things like that. Okay, so what I'm doing in today's talk is just summarizing what did he say in his chapter. I think it's called The Mirage of Inflation. Okay, before I get into the meat of what did Hazlitt cover in that chapter, what I'm going to say here, I think Hazlitt elsewhere in the book talks about this distinction I'm going to make, but he doesn't actually do it in this particular chapter. But I think it's important for me to explain it here. So forgive me, this is the longest thing I'll read for you guys, but it's important. So this is from Mises, who we're a fan of him here at the Institute. And he says, there is nowadays a very reprehensible, even dangerous semantic confusion that makes it extremely difficult for the non-expert to grasp the true state of affairs. Inflation, as this term was always used everywhere, and especially in this country, and so here he was giving a talk in the United States, means increasing the quantity of money and banknotes in circulation and the quantity of banknotes subject to check. But people today use the term inflation to refer to the phenomenon that is an inevitable consequence of inflation, that is, the tendency of all price and wage rates to rise. The result of this deplorable confusion is that there is no term left to signify the cause of this rise in prices and wages. There is no longer any word available to signify the phenomenon that has been, up till now, called inflation. It follows that nobody cares about inflation in the traditional sense of the term. As you cannot talk about something that has no name, you cannot fight it. Those who pretend to fight inflation are in fact only fighting what is the inevitable consequence of inflation, rising prices. Their ventures are doomed to failure because they do not attack the root of the evil. Okay, so, and this is interesting for him because Mises wrote what's translated as the theory of money and credit in 1912. And so, like, he's not here just repeating what some guy told him. Like, he lived through this. He experienced this in his professional career to see that, yes, and he was a monetary theorist. It wasn't just that he was into economics. Like, he was one of the pioneers in monetary theory. And so Mises is just stressing. So I think this, I just read for you, I think was in the 50s or 60s, he gave a talk in the United States. But the point being that originally what inflation meant was inflating the money supply. And money either meaning like the actual, narrow like amount of notes that were the official currency, but also like bank loans could be added into there, right? So inflating that, one of the inevitable consequences, prices would go up. Would tend to go up, in that currency. And so inflation, and so what I do in my work just to try to avoid confusion is I use adjectives, like, so I refer to monetary inflation and price inflation, or I might even say consumer price inflation to get real specific. Because you'll notice when people say, we're worried about inflation, nowadays they mean prices. And if they're complaining about it, they don't mean, I'm so mad that my stock portfolio's prices went up. That's not what they mean. They mean when I go to the grocery store and the eggs are more expensive, that kind of thing, all right? So Mises' point here is that this has been a semantic shift, and it's not just a harmless that, the British spell color with a U in it and we don't, big deal. That, no, he's saying that because of this shift now, when they say inflation, what do we do about it? If they mean rising prices, that's taking attention away from the fact that the reason that's happening is because of the central bank. And so nowadays, you have this crazy outcome where the Federal Reserve officials will come out and talk about their plan to fight inflation, when definitionally they cause it according to the Misesian use of the term, and then even in the modern sense, it's like they're causing the very thing that they're then saying, we're really trying our best to get it under control, but man, this inflation is really tough to lick, right? So it's insane, but yet that's where we are. Okay, so what Hazlitt does in the beginning of this chapter is he starts going through, and what Hazlitt is very good at rhetorically is taking on the arguments of the people who are in favor of whatever bad policy he's going to critique in the chapter, whether he's talking about tariffs or minimum wage laws or whatever, rent control. Hazlitt's going to be against it. He's going to be for the free market, but he's very good at summarizing and saying the people who are proponents of this policy will say this, right? And then he just kind of step by step deals with like the crudest, most naive version of the argument. And then, once he knocks that down in 2 seconds, then he'll say, but then the more sophisticated advocate will say, da, 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 da. And then so it's kind of like a circle. So if you're not used to that rhetorical style, it might be a bit tricky to follow. But once you realize that's the approach he's taking, it's very comprehensive. And that's why I think it's so useful. And again, even though this book was written, Joe, is it like 1946? Does that sound right to you? Yeah, that's when it first came out. It's still, the language is a bit, like he's an adult, right? So if you're just a teenager or something, some of the language might be a little bit in terms of the examples he uses and so on. It might not be fully relevant to you. Like if you haven't had a house that you're paying a mortgage on, some of the stuff might just seem like, but other than that, it's still, like, I highly recommend it in terms of just a standalone book to go through this stuff. But so anyway, so on this one, he starts out very simply and just says some of the advocates of inflation, they're making the most simplistic mistake of conflating money with wealth, right? And so just very naively, everybody knows, oh, if I had twice as much money, right? If I had right now, I had $1,000. If I had $2,000, I would be wealthier. You know, I would be able to go buy more stuff. I would feel richer. When you talk about how much am I worth, if we could just double that number by giving me more money, well, that would be great. All right, and they said, but obviously that doesn't follow through for everybody. If we just double the total stock of money in the entire economy, it's not that we would all collectively be twice as wealthy. And why is that? And this is very simple, but let me just go ahead and say it in case you've never thought it through, that the reason that won't work is that just because there's twice as much money doesn't mean that there's twice as many cars, there's twice as many houses and so on, right? So any one individual, if that person had an extra $1 million in cash, let's say, like in the US, dollar bills, right? That would benefit that person. They would feel wealthier, they would be wealthier. They could go out and buy more stuff. But obviously, if you just gave an extra $1 million in paper Federal Reserve notes to every single person in the community, they couldn't all go out and buy mansions and sports cars and so on, because what would happen, they would just bid up the prices of those things. Then all of a sudden people would realize, oh, wow, last Thursday, having an extra $1 million in cash was a big deal, but now it's not, because now eggs are $100 a carton, right? So that's what would happen. And it's, even though that's a very elementary thing to do, and maybe some of you thought of that when you were 8 years old, that's beyond where a lot of people are right now. When they advocate for just naive inflationism, that's the way they think. And so, Hazlitt spends some time knocking that down. And then also, too, if that were true, if it really were that simple, it would lead you to ask, well, how come there's still poverty? You know what I mean? Why haven't they printed money? And maybe you could say, well, because the elites in many places are really against that and whatever, they want to hoard it for themselves. But surely one government somewhere in human history would have just started printing money, and then other people would be billionaires, like in our sense of the term, and yet that hasn't happened, right? So that's the obvious explanation for that. Okay, so then he goes on and he says, now that I've walked you through just that very simplistic explanation of what's wrong with pure naive inflationism, where people are just, you know what? Let me say one other thing on that to make sure you're getting the argument why I said that it's conflating money with wealth. The one good for which what I just said is the case is money, right? With other goods, that's not the case. That if you said, oh yeah, somebody who has one house, he might think if you had two houses, he would be a lot wealthier. But I mean, if we gave everybody two houses, and that would be true, everybody would be that much wealthier, right? In other words, if you gave more real goods, if you doubled or quintupled or multiplied by 100 how many apple trees we had, or how much farmland, or anything else that was a component of wealth, then it would work. It would scale. There wouldn't be what's called a fallacy of composition. That the same thing that would make one person wealthier, if you increased, how many houses they had or how many sports cars they had, if you did that for the community as a whole, each individual, it would follow, right? That and this is because you'd have more actual wealth. The one type of good where that doesn't work is when it comes to the money good. Okay, so just again, that's why there's something special there. That it's not wrong for an individual to include the units of money in the calculation of that person's net worth, right? When you want to say, like, how many assets does this person have? If you have a bunch of cash in a home safe, it's not wrong to include that, but there is just something subtle involved that, if you just add that up for the community as a whole, you got to be careful, especially if you're talking about fiat money, right? If it's like gold and silver coins, yeah, having more gold coins makes the community wealthier in a real sense, because you could melt the gold down and do something with it besides just being the money. But qua money, in its role as the money unit, just increasing the stockpile doesn't actually make us wealthier, right? And that's very peculiar to money per se. And so if money's just a component of wealth, that's why you just got to be careful. All right. So after he goes through all that, explains that subtlety, then he says the situation's worse than that, though, when it comes to standard arguments, that are pro-inflationary. That you might think from the previous discussion that, doubling the stockpile of money it's not going to help anything, right? It just means in the long run, prices will basically double. But you might think it's kind of a wash. So yeah, go ahead and do it, but just don't think anything good's going to come out of it. It's just we're all going to kind of tread water and all the prices will double, but all the wage rates will double and everything. And then he says that that's actually not true either, because in reality, the new money comes in through a very specific process, okay? And then that shows, when you walk through the consequences of that, it shows that there's a redistribution. Okay, so to be clear, just use the example, doubling the stockpile of money that the community holds can't make everybody wealthier, right? Because again, you don't have more coal mines, you don't have more farmland and so on, but it's not that everyone magically is just indifferent. It's that some people are hurt and some people benefit. So there's a redistribution of wealth among sectors. And the sequence that he goes through, and that this is pretty standard in this kind of literature, is just a step-by-step that, let's say the government prints up money and uses it to buy tanks. Well, then the firms that make the tanks, hire the workers, and buy the raw materials to make the tanks, they're the original recipients of that new money. So they actually benefit from this process. And the way that he explains it, and I think probably works in terms of just a logical step-by-step argument, is that you could imagine that prices only rise gradually as new money flows into those sectors. In reality, just on the side here, I'm saying to you, you could imagine something more sophisticated where people knowing of the policy, they might respond before the new money hits their area. But just in terms of thinking it through, if you haven't thought of this before, the baseline scenario, just think of it as a step-by-step process where you're in original equilibrium, people have a certain amount of cash, wage rates are a certain amount, prices are a certain amount, and then yes, the government just creates out of thin air a boatload of new money that they use to buy fighter jets or tanks or whatever. And so the firms selling those to the government, they have higher sales. Then they can give dividends to their shareholders. Those people really are wealthier because there's a sense in which they go out into the community armed with all this newly printed money, and prices are basically the same as they were the day before. So they can buy things, and then it just step by step goes through the community. So Hazlitt does it like he's got A, B, C, D in terms of like segments of the community. And he's saying the people in segment A benefit from the inflation because they get the new money early on. The people in B benefit, but not as much, because now when the people in B, who are like the people who sell the luxury goods to the shareholders of the defense industry, okay? So by the time those industries see their demand for their products go up, prices in general, like the steel or whatever that went into the tanks, is now more expensive than it was before the inflation started, right? So they're already, getting the money a little bit late in the game, and so prices already are higher, but still they benefit on net. And then the idea is the people then in Group C, by the time they get it, they're the people that the next round go and spend their money on. Then, they've been seeing prices going up step by step while their income has been the same in money terms. And then you see how it goes. And then finally, the poor people in Group D, who are the last recipients, all along, they've seen prices going up in pockets here and there, while how they get their income has stayed the same in money terms. So they're losing throughout all that because now they can't buy as much at the store. And then finally, when their wages respond, or however it is they get their income, at that point they're just catching up, right? So they're finally just being made whole in terms of the levels compared to the original equilibrium, but all throughout that process they've been behind. Okay, so that's the sense, and he's just showing mechanically how to think about it, like one particular iteration of that sequence, where you can see how that redistribution would happen. So again, when the dust settles, as a first approximation, you can say, doubling the quantity of money isn't going to make society, isn't going to raise per capita income. It's just going to kind of double everything, all the prices. And that's basically, that's a decent first approximation, but that hides the fact that there's a lot of redistribution throughout that process. So that's called Cantillon effects. I'm sure you may have heard that term, but that's what that refers to, that was the economist who first really spelled that out, that process. Let me mention, in terms of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, one way that you can think about it is that Mises, when he's explaining what causes the boom-bust cycle in a market economy, is the specific application of what happens if the new money that's entering the system comes in via the loan market. All right, so the example I just did there was, what if the way the new money comes in is that the government prints it up, or it can be electronic, and then they start buying tanks with it, right? And I just walked you through there. But then another issue would be, okay, what if the way the new money gets in the system is that the banks engage in fractional reserve banking, and so there's a sense in which when they make loans, that increases the quantity of money, and what if that's how the new money enters the system, is by banks loaning it into existence? Okay, and then so that has its consequences. But so if you think about there, what happens is the disturbance originally comes in when the rate of interest gets pushed down, and it doesn't the full rippling effects of that new money haven't yet worked their way through the system. And so there's very particular consequences if the first stage of that new money flowing in is from banks loaning it into existence. All right, so you could say that Mises' theory of the business cycle is one application of possible Cantillon effects of inflation coming in through that particular sector. All right, so I just want to make sure I'm not losing you. My point is, if you're just talking about generically the effects of inflation, it makes a difference if the government just were to print up money and just hand it out to people on a per capita basis. It would still have these effects that I'm talking about, because even if they gave it to everybody in terms of how much money you have right now, we'll just double it. Some people might go out and spend it, or some people might put it on their mattress. Or, you know what I mean? So even there's no way to do it so it's just a perfect wash and all the prices just respond proportionally. But I'm saying it obviously matters the particular way it comes in. All right, so that's the theory of the business cycle that I know you heard earlier this week. You can fit it into this framework that way. Excuse me. Okay, so then Hazlitt rhetorically, he's going through. So he showed, just printing money just obviously can't make us all wealthier in a very naive sense. Then he says there are these redistribution effects. And then he says, okay, now the more sophisticated proponents of inflation will say that, if there's periods where there's massive unemployment or other idle resources, in that kind of a situation, inflation really can work. All right, so let me just show you, so again, he's being very clever and fair to his opponents by he's showing possible loopholes in the arguments he's making, up to that point in the chapter. So originally, if you think back when he said, hey, just printing up money can't possibly make us all wealthier because, hey, we're not making more coal mines, we're not making more oil deposits, farmland, and so on. He sort of implicitly was assuming there was what you could call full employment in the beginning, right? So if all the resources are fully employed, everyone's got a job, all the farmland's being used to grow the crops, blah, 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 and now we just double the quantity of money, how can that make more fruit production or oil production or whatever, cars rolling off the assembly line per period if we originally were fully employed, right? And so therefore, it seems obvious printing up money per se doesn't increase the flows of any of those real goods and services coming to market. So obviously, we can't be better off in real terms. But then again, so now he's at this point in the chapter, he says, what if we originally started out in a depressed economy? Because this is now what some of the more sophisticated advocates of inflation say. Here, maybe by injecting more purchasing power and raising aggregate demand, we can jumpstart the economy. And that earlier argument we made about you can't make us wealthier in real terms just by printing money, well, maybe that is true if for some reason the economy was in a slump. 10% of the workforce was just sitting home doing nothing. Maybe now printing money can suck them back into the workforce, and so therefore, that original critique doesn't work. All right, so that's the argument. And so he says, among other things, that this partly what this relies on is that for there to be this slump in the first place, this unused capacity or idle capacity, unemployed resources, there must be some mismatch in what he calls prices and costs, right? So all costs are prices too, and he knows that. He's just trying to be colloquial. So what he means is you're a business enterprise, and the amount that you can sell your goods and services to your own customers for, and then you look at, well, what are the costs of production for me to make those things? If there's some problem where, for whatever reason, the costs are so high and that what I can sell the finished product for is not high enough to meet that, well, I'm just going to stop, right? I'm not going to pay people $10 an hour for them to make something that I can only sell for $9. That's the issue. Okay, and so Hazlitt is saying that what some of the advocates of inflation are claiming is that in a slump, what happens is the amount that the workers are demanding in terms of money wages is at a certain level, and that the prices aren't high enough to make that profitable, so they're not hired. And so why don't we just come up with a way that if we just print enough money that can raise the prices of the finished, the final goods, so now the firm will be willing to hire them. Okay, so that's the argument. And you can see if that were true, then that defeats that original objection, right? Then you can see, oh yeah, so the reason we really are wealthier, even in real terms, is because now the unemployment rate went from 10% down to 3%. So there's more people working, so that's why more physical stuff is getting produced. All right, so as I'm saying here, one point he makes is that even on its own terms, this is relying in a bit on deception. That if you're saying that the workers, because another way that this could be achieved, right? If the workers need $10 an hour, but what they're making is only, the firm can only sell for $9, then you could say, yeah, if you could somehow cause inflation and raise this to 11, then it would work. You'd pay them 10 and sell the product for 11. But by the same token, what if their wages could fall to 8? And then it would also work, right? And you don't need inflation to get their wages to fall. So what the proponents of inflation will say is, oh, the workers, they won't, for psychological reasons, for various other types of reasons, there's sticky wages, right? That's a phrase that gets thrown around, sticky. What's weird is in the 1920 and 21 depression, wages were not sticky. They fell quite rapidly, and that's why you didn't have a depression all through the 1920s. Whereas in the early 1930s, wages all of a sudden became sticky, all right? So that stickiness is not just a fact of nature or even a fact of the market economy. There were particular things the Hoover administration did in conjunction with labor unions that make wages sticky in the early 30s, all right? So there's that element. But even on its own terms, Hazlitt's saying it still involves deception, right? If the workers say we would not tolerate a wage cut, then you still are implicitly, lowering their real wages, their inflation-adjusted wages, if you're just raising prices, but the wage rate's staying the same, right? So there's that element, and then beyond whether you think that's valid or not in terms of morality, he's saying just pragmatically that's not a long-term solution. That eventually the labor unions, particularly for well-organized workers, are going to realize what's happening, and then they're going to build in cost of living adjustment clauses into their contracts that say, if we were demanding a money wage rate of 10 when the average price level was 9, I'm just speaking loosely here, and then if prices go up to 11, well then you better raise our pay to 12, and so you're still going to have that mismatch. Okay, so those are the arguments that Hazlitt makes in this section. Let me just read something. I thought this was a funny paragraph that he had here. So he says, he's talking about this general phenomenon where there could be mismatches between certain costs of production in the finished goods and the claim that, hey, if we just printed a bunch of money and threw it in the system, couldn't that, allow for spikes in prices here and there that could kind of lubricate things and get the economy back on its feet? And so he says, true, inflation may sometimes correct them, meaning like these mismatches, but it is a heady and dangerous method. It makes its corrections not openly and honestly, but by the use of illusion. It is like getting people up an hour earlier only by making them believe that it is 8 o'clock when it is really 7. It is perhaps no mere coincidence that a world which has to resort to the deception of turning all its clocks ahead an hour in order to accomplish this result should be a world that has to resort to inflation to accomplish an analogous result in the economic sphere. Okay, so that's interesting. But the reason I thought that was like quaint and charming is, he was born in the late 1800s, so he lived through the imposition of what we call daylight savings time, right? Like that was really put in place in World War I in the United States, and then it kind of was rolled back, and then it came back in World War II, and I think it was in 1966 is when they, firmly established it as a permanent thing. So I'm saying Hazlitt, could remember, back in my day, the time was actually the real time. We didn't just change all the clocks to get everyone to behave the way we wanted. And if you wanted everyone to get up an hour earlier to save energy or something, you would just say, hey, instead of waking up at 6 o'clock, why don't we wake up at 5? You wouldn't change the clocks. That's, you know what I mean? Like, it'd be like if you wanted to promote, nutrition to have people be taller, if instead you just change the rulers instead of feeding people better or something, right? Like that's kind of what he's getting at there. So again, what I thought was cute about that is he's like lamenting, like, yeah, can you imagine the kind of society that changes the clocks? But to us, we're like, well, yeah, that's what we do. Twice a year, we change the clock, so just like, well, yeah, if the government needs more money, it just prints it. What's the big deal? There's no constraints. So anyway, I'm just saying it's funny that he's harking back to a time when, like, to him, that's just anathema. Okay, let me here spend a bit of time just on this last part that's possibly confusing, and we go to 45 with this one, right? Okay, I'll probably have time for a question or two. Okay, so let me just go ahead and read this. He says, suppose the public works. So what he's doing, by the way, here, he's contrasting and saying how the government can't just create more prosperity, create more jobs just by spending money on something. And so at first he says, well, if it's just out of explicit taxation, it's crystal clear that the government's not going to be able to create jobs that way, right? Because if it's going to spend $1 billion here creating jobs in this area, it had to tax the money from somewhere else, and so the public can't spend the money over there, so jobs get destroyed over here. So on net, so that's kind of the argument he was making. And so now here, he's coming in to, he's going to first talk about borrowing the money, and then he's going to go on to talk about, well, what if they just printed it, right? So the printing stuff we've already kind of covered, but here, just to round out this discussion, and again, since I'm pointing you guys to go read this, I didn't want any of you to possibly get an erroneous view here. Let me just explain this one little piece, and then we'll have time for a question too. He says, suppose the public works are not paid for from the proceeds of taxation. Suppose they are paid for by deficit financing, that is, from the proceeds of government borrowing or from resort to the printing press. Then the result just described does not seem to take place. The public works seem to be created out of new purchasing power. You cannot say that the purchasing power has been taken away from the taxpayers. For the moment, the nation seems to have gotten something for nothing. Okay, so everyone see what he's doing there, that if the way Henry Hazlitt originally said, the government just spending money to create jobs over here, something's got to be wrong with that if they tax it. Okay, and now, again, he's just trying to say, well, what if they say, well, they didn't tax that money, they just borrowed it. Okay, so he explains if they do it through borrowing, eventually they're going to have to start paying back the loan. They just can't keep having the debt grow exponentially. At some point, they're going to have to start financing that debt. So once he establishes that, then now he says, and so now we can see the problem with this approach. Yet when the government comes to repay the debt it has accumulated for public works, it must necessarily tax more heavily than it spends. In this later period, therefore, it must necessarily destroy more jobs than it creates. The extra heavy taxation then required does not merely take away purchasing power, it also lowers or destroys incentives to production, and so reduces the total wealth and income of the country. Okay, so here, let me just explain what I don't want you to walk away thinking from this. It sounds like Hazlitt is saying, yes, it's true on the front end, if the government spends a bunch of money that it borrowed, it could create jobs, but don't think that that's a good idea, because then at some point down the road, they're going to have to run a surplus. They're going to have to tax more than they spend, down the road, and at that point, they'll be destroying jobs. So we're not gaining over the whole cycle, right? It sounds like that's what he's saying, and that's not correct, right? So that's what I want to, and again, this is partly like kind of a high-level thing, just because I know some of this talk was pretty introductory. So here I just want to hit this esoteric point. I think what Hazlitt is doing here is just rhetorically, he's just trying to say, even if somebody thinks this makes sense, that by deficit spending you create jobs with no countervailing loss, that can't be right, because then down the road you would be, doing the opposite. So therefore, but in case you think he's saying this is really what would happen, that's what I want to clarify, that's not correct. And in particular, the reason I want to stress that is, suppose right now we did get a budget hawk, and suppose like the Doge stuff really went through and the government really did start running $300 billion annual surpluses for the next few years to try to start paying down the debt. It's not the case that we would have to have 12% unemployment because, as Hazlitt says here, when they do that, no, you'd still have full employment. In other words, it doesn't hurt the labor market for the government to run a budget surplus. Okay, so if you're saying like specifically what's the problem here, it's, again, I'm not sure if he was saying this literally or he just meant for the sake of argument, even if someone thought this is how the world works, blah, blah, blah. But the reason the world doesn't work this way is when the government is running a surplus, it's that money is still going back to the private sector, right? In other words, if they tax $1 trillion and they only spend $800 billion, so they're running a $200 billion surplus, what does that mean? The surplus, the people who have treasury debt, they're getting the $200 billion. That's what it means. Okay, so that money is still flowing out of the government's hands. And I would say it'd be far better, given that the money's going to come from taxation, go to Washington, and then go out to the community. I would say it's way better if what it's doing is retiring outstanding bonds, treasury bonds, rather than funding new government spending, right, in terms of buying goods and services or whatever. Okay, so there's that element. So I'm saying that's the specific mechanical issue. Even if they burned it, right, just in general, forget government debt. Let's just say they taxed $1 trillion and they could spend it on stuff, or they could just burn half of it every year. I would recommend burning half of it every year, right? Because that would cause, the amount of money to shrink, and then that would cause prices to fall. So there'd be the public would have, the money they retain would have higher purchasing power. Okay, so again, it's you want to get away from the notion of that, oh, well, at least if the government spends the money, it'll get back in the economy or it'll create jobs. You know what I mean? That's not the way to think about it. That if the government spends the money, then that causes those real resources to get sucked into whatever the government spends it on. Whereas if they just burn it, the real resources are not getting redirected into political uses, right? So prices and wages can adjust. So that's maybe another way to think about it. Whatever the money stock is, after the initial shock and people understand what's going on, prices and wages can adjust so everybody can get a job. So it can't be that perpetually you'd have high unemployment because the government's running a surplus or something. That doesn't work, right? So I just wanted to clarify that. And we've got 8 minutes left if people want to ask questions. And there's a guy with a mic back there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have a question. Many people say about the high cost inflation. Some say it's not due to expanding the money supply. It could be, for example, supply chain issues, labor shortages, or even some come like use that as an excuse to raise prices. And many people make these claims. What do you say to refute that or to fact check that?
Okay, sure. So the question, just in case you didn't hear, is, we've been talking about increasing the quantity of money, and that's what causes price inflation. But aren't there other possible causes? And people, can talk about supply chain and so forth. So yeah, it is true, and that's a good point. I don't want you to take away from this talk that we believe in, as Austrians, a mechanical view that, if you increase if the inflation rate or price inflation rate is 10%, that means the quantity of money must have gone up by 10%. That's not what we're saying at all. There's, everything is subjective in economics, even the price of money, if you want to think of it that way. All right. So if, for example, the Federal Reserve announced tomorrow that, hey, starting in August, we're going to increase, we're going to give everybody $1 trillion new dollars in cash, every single American, that would cause prices to go up right now, right? Even before that new money came into the system, because people who are holding dollar-denominated assets would look ahead and realize, whoa, when that new money comes in, that's going to make things quoted in dollars go way up in price. I don't want to be holding dollars when that happens in August. So right now, everyone's trying to get rid of dollars. That's going to make prices go up, the value of the dollar sink. Okay, so I'm just saying you can go through little thought experiments like that to see there's not this mechanical relationship. Having said that, though, and likewise too, if there's some problem, there's an earthquake or something, and the real amount of output gets cut in half, you could have other things equal. If the demand to hold money is the same, then you would expect prices to double, right? Because there's half as much output, and so if people have the same amount of cash that they're trying to spend, then prices would tend to double. You could imagine that. But when you see periods of very high price inflation, it's not because there's just a series of worse and worse earthquakes that keep happening, right? That's not what's going on. So any historical example, particularly what's called a hyperinflation, where the value of the money falls to 1/1 billionth of what it used to be, that's not because output is 1/1 billionth of what it used to be. It's always them printing boatloads of money in practice in terms of when the currency crashes. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
I see some libertarians say that along with spending cuts, we should also have higher taxes so that the government can pay the debts. I don't think that's ethical. On the other hand, I see Hoppe say that, just have the government say, we're not going to pay debts, just let it go, and then no one's going to buy government bonds anymore. So yeah, what would you say to that?
Okay, yeah, great question. Again, in case you didn't hear that, he's saying some libertarians he's heard will say that in general, when someone starts a sentence, I've heard some libertarians say you got to just brace, it's going to be something awful. That he said dealing with the debt, it's not merely that it's too simplistic or ideological just to hope for spending cuts. That also we should be adults in the room and tolerate a tax hike in order to to close the deficit. And also, but then he's heard other libertarians say things like, well, what if they just defaulted on the debt? Okay, so that's great, and that's a good final question. Let me just speak a few minutes on that, and we'll wrap up. Okay, and this came up with the arguments over the so-called big beautiful bill, and I was like polling people and trying to get a sense of it too, and it was interesting to see. So I think from a libertarian property rights perspective, that taxation is theft, and so if that's where you're coming from, any tax cut is justified, right? And so ideally what you would do is you would cut spending as well, all right? But if you're saying, no, that's not an option for whatever reason, doing these thought experiments, the government's going to keep spending, it was what it's going to do, would you tolerate a tax cut? I think the answer, from a libertarian perspective is yes, because again, you're just saying, would you like to reduce the amount of theft in society? And generally speaking, the answer to that is yes, of course I would. And specifically when it comes to this issue of funding government spending and shrinking the deficit, the problem, the downside is you say, oh, but if we just give a huge tax cut today and we don't cut spending correspondingly, then that means, going into the future, there's going to be a bigger stock of government debt, right? Because more people now are lending to the government. And so the response I would say to that is, right, so at worst, all you're doing is postponing the theft, right? Like, in other words, worst case scenario just means you're stealing less today to fund the spending, and down the road you got to steal more. But I think, there's two other possibilities. It could be that down the road, as those people are inheriting this bigger stockpile of debt, it could be that quote crowds out some of the other spending. So it might be that because, like, for example, interest on the debt gets bigger and bigger, maybe other spending programs don't rise as fast as they otherwise would have. Okay, so there is that element. So I don't think we should just take it as a given that government spending is just going to do what it's going to do, and then taxation and the deficit are completely independent components of that. I don't think that's correct, in the real world. So there's that element. But then even beyond that, it's not a given that they have to tax people down the road to finance the debt. Like you're saying, it is possible they could just down the road default, either partially or explicitly. And so if they default by inflation, then that's still just theft through a different mechanism. But if what they do is they just say down the road, yeah, we owe these people $1 billion, we got $10 billion of government bonds maturing this month. We don't have it. We've only got $5 billion. You know what? We're going to give everybody a 50% haircut. We owe you contractually $10 billion. Here's $5 billion. Sorry. That's your fault for trusting Uncle Sam. They could do that. That's possible, right? Corporations do that. That's what happens. And so from a libertarian perspective, that is a much better alternative, right? If the idea is, yes, by cutting taxes, it means there's a higher likelihood down the road that they will default on the debt. Again, if by default we mean explicitly they don't pay as much as the Treasury security says the person's legally entitled to, then yeah, they violated a contract with that person, but that's not stealing. In this, just like if a company sells bonds, then down the road, doesn't have a good quarter and can't meet its bond payment, that's not theft. That's not like robbing a bank. Whereas sticking guns at people and saying, give us some of your paycheck or you're going in a cage, that is explicitly theft, in a Rothbardian framework. So that's kind of the way they handle it. And then last thing I'll say on that, you might say, okay, there's your ideology, whatever, but come on, practically speaking, defaulting, that would be a very consequential thing. And right, but also at the same token, then the lesson would be learned and people might say, okay, maybe we shouldn't be treating U.S. treasuries as the safest possible asset. And so if people then from that point forward were more circumspect about lending money to the government, that's arguably a good thing, not just from a libertarian property perspective, but even from an economic perspective, because Uncle Sam's actually not that good of an allocator of capital. Okay, thanks everybody.